objects to be fixed and to be moved back into normality. God help us. Half the problem we've got is trying to make people normal in the sick world in many ways, which our part is to be part of healing, and it starts with ourselves.
Welcome, everyone, to the Vegan Posse Self-Love series, which is dedicated to expanding our tenderness, affection, curiosity, and general delight in one very important animal, ourselves. As many of you know, I'm currently working on a companion guide to my novel, Marrying Myself, which will be sort of a self-love playbook. In the process of creating this companion guide, I decided to tap into the wisdom of some of the previous guests I've had on the show. And today I'm thrilled to welcome back Clare Mann, the existential psychologist who coined the term vystopia for the anguish of living as a vegan in a not yet vegan world. In fact, it was my own vystopia that inspired me to start the Vegan Posse, to build community among all of us living in this parallel universe of consciousness and justice and love. So Clare, welcome back to the Vegan Posse. As you may recall, I start regular Vegan Posse episodes by asking people if they're ready for the ride of their life. But in this special series, I would like to ask, are you ready for the love of your life?
Oh, that's wonderful. And everything you were saying is kind of music to my ears. All those positive words, inspiration, curiosity, they have a different effect on a brain, don't they? So yes, I am ready for the love of my life.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm interested in both your personal experience with self-love and your clinical perspective as a psychologist. And so for my current research class in grad school, I'm now in grad school for clinical mental health counseling, and I decided to do some formal research on the subject of self-love just to find out if it's something that's really been subjected to scientific scrutiny. And I found that it has become the subject of more research. And in fact, one study that I came across boiled it down to 3 components. So according to them, the components of self-love are: number 1, self-contact, defined as giving attention to oneself. 2 was self-acceptance, defined as being at peace with oneself. And 3 is self-care, defined as being protective of and caring for oneself. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about what you think of this ingredient list for self-love and where you are with each of these components.
Yes. Well, so, it's interesting. So we got contact, acceptance, and care. The contact was interesting when you first said it. It was actually talking about physical connection with your physical self, or a sense of knowing yourself. What was the research saying?
It was attention to yourself. So they called it self-contact, but really it's self-attention.
Right, I'm with you. Okay. Well, these all sound incredibly worthy things, don't they? And like anything, on the opposite, mental ill health, for instance, I believe it's a continuum. So, if we have such a level of indulgence in ourselves, potentially, where we are perhaps egotistical, or we overly involved in our physical appearance, for instance, and spend a lot of money on that, and we'll come back to the state in our society at the moment, we could actually move to a level of almost narcissism. Okay. But at another level, you've got people that are so uncomfortable in their physical bodies, or don't want to answer questions about themselves. It doesn't matter what I think, and my opinion isn't important. So if we see it like a continuum on each of these, I think it's really helpful to have that healthy balance of that beautiful self-contact is, and my impression of that would be, in my own experience, would be that ability to go inside, to be curious about yourself, to get in touch with your conscious and unconscious influences, beliefs, values, constantly question your behavior, your self-talk. Is it positive? Is it negative? And that's often a journey that people need to be assisted to go on, because their own upbringing, society, you're not good enough, these sort of messages result in someone trying to use external factors to say, well, I want to fit into the crowd and look like those. But that's, I would say, is not a good sense of self-contact. So I think it is both physical and acceptance of one's body, whatever state that is in, whether it's ill, broken limbs, overweight, underweight, whatever, is to start from the period of, this is an absolute miracle that we even exist, but not only in a physical realm, but who are we? Who is the observer that is looking out in the world, making choices, decisions, and sees themselves separate from the other and yet interconnected? So that's the first one. That self-acceptance, I guess, comes into that peace, that awareness that, often it takes younger people perhaps a little while. They go through a stage of caring what people think, and maybe that's a level of breaking away from one's family, autonomy, those sort of things. But that real acceptance of, and not acquiescence is, oh, well, I can't do that, everyone else can do it. But just saying, in and of myself, I am lovable, I am able, before I do anything, it's unconditional. And of course, not many, but I hope, like to think a sizable amount, have good enough parenting. But if we have overly critical parents, for instance, that internalized sense of criticism can come. But if you've got a healthy sense that says, I don't like your behavior, but I love you and I always will, we can internalize that sort of love for ourselves. And then, of course, the self-care and knowing the difference between indulgence and laziness, but actually know when to withdraw from people, to take time out, to have, sometimes the greatest love we can show ourselves is discipline, routines and practices that actually create what I call a strong foundation. So I love all of those different sections. And so that's my general thing on that. Would you like me to talk more personally, or?
Thank you. Yeah, well, one subject that you brought up that I'm always interested to hear more about is the distinction of self-love from narcissism. Because obviously, we've got a society that's really fueling a lot of narcissism, and many people claim that there's a narcissism epidemic. I don't know how our current society compares to previous generations, but I've certainly seen my share of narcissism. But how would you distinguish self-love from that unhealthy sort of
Sure. Yeah.
pathological hyper focus on self?
Yeah, well, let's have a look where, narcissism comes from in terms of the term. It was Narcissus. It's a Greek mythology story that of Narcissus being totally obsessed with themselves and sitting by a lake and looking in the mirror and just saying how beautiful I am, I'm amazing, I'm perfect, I'm whatever, in an indulgent way. Obviously, there was a fable and a parable to actually go with that. Um, I think these words are bandied around a lot these days. Oh, he's a narcissist. Oh,
Right.
I heard the other day, I'm gaslighting myself. And I said, how does that work? People sort of hear these sort of often psychological definitions based on research, and then they just bandy them around in the popular psychology and go, oh, he's a narcissist. I saw it online, I Googled it. But really, when we talk about extreme narcissism, for instance, it's a level of indulgence and self-awareness that is one of the most terrible forms of parenting, because the parents will love bomb the children one minute and then ignore them and abuse them the next. So there's this very mercurial backwards and forwards, inconsistent, unconditional. And when we're dealing with, I say, victims of that type of parenting, in the same way that very depressed parents, the child has no agency to have an effect on their world, which they can't then internalize, there is this enormous often overcompensation by people to behave in a certain way to not result in the angry parent sort of thing, but they continue this throughout their lives. But then they have this very, very low self-esteem, and I'm not good enough, an overinflated sense of the effect they have on the world. If people are upset in the office, well, it must be me, almost. So at one level, it's putting themselves down, but then they're internalizing that accentuated part, the over love bombing bit that says I'm all important. It must have been me that upset the culture in the office. So, I would say that's the opposite of self-love, because you haven't even really got in contact with the silent observer who See, the person who says, I'm not unwell, or I don't love myself, or I do love myself, let's go down the negative for a moment. I'm not good enough. I don't deserve this. The one who's actually saying it does not feel or do that. Like, I know I'm depressed and I need to do something. The observer is not depressed. It's perhaps call it a higher self, a part of an aspect, because they're observing this human condition, this experience of relationship with themselves, and referring to something better or something missing. And I think that's the grasp of I try to get people in contact with what is the part of you that's observing and knows there's something better. It's still you. I mean, I am touching my arm, but it's all me. And there's
Right,
that very
right.
existential perspective of, who's the observer and the observed, and how
Mm-hmm.
do we come to know ourselves through interactions. So that level of narcissism is a lack of awareness of the co-creation with other people and interconnectedness with our outside world. Um, if we behave badly towards other people, there are usually consequences, and the healthy person says, well, what was my part in creating this big argument? Or, what did I contribute to that? Because if you've ever noticed, whenever you've got a problem, you're always there. So, that's a healthy sort of awareness of the narcissist isn't really aware of other people in that sort of sense. They're not aware that yesterday they were love bombing someone, and the next day they're being horrible. There's no shame, embarrassment. Hey, I'm having an off day. There's not even the awareness, and people are just so stupid anyway that they should just suck it up or whatever. So that's a real level of indulgence. But that's not self-love. It comes from a very internalized critical parent. It's overindulgence in physical appearance, of course, body size. Um, it can be, muscles and going to the gym, but it's where there is not a healthy regard for yourself. It's looking at other people and trying to be better than, or I am better than that over. But really, it comes from I'm not good enough. I would suggest self-love would be a more healthy. Done not to punish, not to say I've got to lose weight or I've got some flabby parts in my body, but to just really want that, hey, I'm a process of a continuous improvement. If I've got a healthy body and I feel I look, great in clothes, I'm just going to be prepared to go out in the world and do, be there. But it's not the end of the world when they eat the cream cake, vegan cream, of course.
Right, right. Yeah, my intuitive sense of self-love versus narcissism is, how it feels in my body. Self-love when I'm living in love, when I'm operating from that foundation of self-love,
Yeah,
I feel expansive and I feel open and I feel less needy. I'm not looking
that's right.
for validation at every turn. And by the same token, I'm not instantly resentful the second somebody doesn't afford me the adulation that I'm
Yeah,
expecting or
yeah.
think I deserve because I've already got that foundation of
Good.
self-love. So I don't need that constant praise. And also I feel like for me, self-love, it invites me to make my world bigger. It opens up my consciousness and just opens up my sense of possibility. Whereas narcissism, it tends to constrict me and cause me to want to make my world smaller because that way I get to be a big fish, albeit in a smaller pond, but I get to feel
Yes.
grandiose and important in that smaller framework. Um,
Mm.
so that's just my own experience with it.
It's
I'm curious.
beautifully put, I might say, beautifully
Pardon
put,
me?
and I'm so glad we're recording it because it's almost poetical. You've hit the nail on the head. You're absolutely right. It's
Well,
wonderful.
it's been interesting because so much of this comes from intuition, and that's why I decided, I am in graduate school, and so why
Yeah.
not take advantage of this time in my academic life to
Mm.
actually explore these concepts. So it has been interesting to formally research the academic findings on
Mm.
these topics that I've formed, intuitive impressions about. But self-love, it's one of these concepts that at this, on the one hand, it seems in so many ways kind of like a fluff concept, like something that's just, it's another one of those terms that's sort of bandied around and sometimes can lose its meaning or become confused with different other terms. I'm curious, how would you distinguish self-love from self-esteem?
Oh, that's interesting. I think they're interconnected. Again, probably more of an intuitive response. So self-love, it implies some sort of action, I would say, and some kind of self-esteem would be a state of being, relatively okay sense that I'm good enough. You know, I have ups and downs. I might have been a bit embarrassed what I said to someone the other day, but there isn't that internal shaming going on. It's like, I'm an okay person. I'm good enough. I'm working improvement, and I guess an overlaying sort of arching state of being. Whereas self-care is a little bit more undulating. So are you really listening to the signals and the signs? And it's interesting you say intuition, because I think that is something we really need to hone, because that's the one that says there's yes and everything else is no. And people get mixed up with emotion, I think. It's like, well, I feel so strongly, that must be what my body's saying and whatever. And as you know from your experience and research, I think there's three ways to make decisions. There's thinking, there's emotion, there's logic and thinking, there's emotion, but then there's intuition. And I think in our world these days, it's been knocked out of us in the scientism that's now on the table, which is the arbiter of all truth. It's actually a methodology, as you know. It's not an actuality. It's become a religion, of course. But our intuition that goes, oh, I know I've got all the evidence, I've got all the details there, but something does not feel right here. And that doesn't mean we immediately throw everything else out, but we do some more research. And I think that has to do with self-love, actually, Chrissy, because for you to spend that much time in the awareness and look at yourself calmly and objectively and take ownership for your part in what you're creating in the world, good and bad, it has to come from that level of knowing, and knowing when to go and apologize, knowing to put your hands up and go, you know, I've got that wrong. And I think in a more narcissistically focused social media, or media full stop, or, you know, mass sort of films and Hollywoods, is that's not always, in fact, it's going the other way. I would say the emasculation of men is, you watch something like The Bourne Identity, or, you know, some of these films, and the guy's the one that's getting really sort of affected by this very brittle, tight sort of woman who's, you know, working at Langley or something, and she's talking to this Navy SEAL as if he's an idiot, and he's the one that gets all emotional, and that switch to try, and I think it's an emasculation of the powerful, strong, protective male, and the strong feminine. It's the woman's come animus dominated in the images we get, and I'm really trying not to swear here, but, you know, it's that sort of a kick in the butt stuff. And the guy's the one that's taking, you know, direction from this. That's all deliberate, of course, in terms of reshaping of society. But our power comes, our self-love comes when we live in the world, but we're not of it in a way. We are, as my own dad at 97 used to say, wear the world like a loose piece of clothing.
Right. Right. I know it is so interesting because, like you said, we've always got that observer self, and that which witnesses unkindness is not itself unkind, and that which witnesses jealousy is not itself jealous. And it's so interesting. Do you think, because often that observer is painted or portrayed as just this neutral, disembodied, transcendent, you know, entity. Do you think that observer self can help us tap into self-love, or is that a different animal?
I'm so sorry. Could you just reshape that question? Could you? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the, you know, how, you know, you practice existential psychology, and like me, you know, you have a meditation practice and cultivate that aspect of yourself. So when we think about this observer self, this higher self who can observe the things that we're doing, how does that observer self relate to self-love? Or are they just completely different constructs in your eyes?
Sure. No, I wouldn't think they were. Well, this is the notion, the experience of separateness and not separateness. So that's the
Right,
existential
right.
awareness and dilemma, isn't it? It's from an existential perspective, I think everything is about relationship. So it's relationship with our own bodies, with ourselves, with our ideologies, with our physical world, our social, our cultural, our familial. These are all co-created worlds which make you the unique experiences. Obviously, there's some sort of consensual reality that you and I have on this podcast, but our experience it and what we're bringing to the room, we're co-creating something different. Just even in this conversation, something new comes out of it, this huge curiosity and opportunity to create more. We get all the solutions to the problems that we've, in front of us, but we can't use the same tools as Einstein said. But I think that so it's looking at relationships with different aspects of ourselves. And I think that more intuitive observer self has the opportunity to say, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have feelings, but I'm not my feelings. I have thoughts, but I'm not just thoughts. And that's living with the existential uncertainty that we can't actually quantify this thing called experience. I can't experience what you're experiencing, but I can experiencing you, experiencing me, experiencing you. And once we talk about the experience, it's past.
Right.
But we can have that relationship. And I think that's where self-love is where we're present with ourselves as well. So, in this moment, we are co-creating together something that in your mind is going into different places, results in different questions. I'm pulling out from my experience in past. And that's what I love about any existential practice. Very different than traditional psychology, because often, and I'm going to say it on the recording, is a much greater respect for psychotherapy than psychology, particularly in a therapeutic way, because we're not objects to be fixed and to be moved back into normality. God help us. Half the problem we've got is trying to make you normal in a sick world in many ways, which our part is to be part of healing, and it starts with ourselves. And but that's more sort of engagement, is encouraging people to be the best they can be. The reason I actually studied existentialism, I was very disgruntled with this notion of you're sick and I'm well. And, we're kind of doomed to be anxious from an existential perspective, in a healthy anxious, almost an existential anxiety or guilt, is because we're here for limited time. How am I living my life? If I choose that, what is the thing I've denied? If I go down that path, how will I know the other one wasn't better? And that's the tyranny of choice in many ways. And a lot of people become mobilized, and the only choice they choose is choosing not to choose. And they just go along with, well, this is just how it is. And I think that tapping into that it starts with the self-love and looking at our infinite possibilities of what we can be. I haven't even scratched the surface, most of us, but we can't do that if we care about what people think, and not in a narcissistic way, is it? It's when we stand up and we say what we feel is, yes, this is right, I have to say it, even when we're not going to be liked. And that has happened in the vegan community as well of late, is it doesn't matter, because you're not doing it because you want accolades or to be popular. You're doing it because it's right, So, but you can only do that if you've got self-love and awareness to get your ego out of the way, really, and not say, well, I'm just going to say what I think, and I'll get all these likes or something. That's an interesting marker these days, isn't it? It's like, wow, for some people, they reduce down to that.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think maybe an additional component of self-love that's missing from that short list is some version of integrity or self-respect. I came across some additional research on the subject of self-respect, which basically determined that was a moral framework. People had self-respect if they were acting in accordance with their values. And they didn't have self-respect if they weren't acting in integrity.
Yes.
Whereas their self-respect, according to this one study, their self-respect wasn't affected by competency levels. So in other words, if they were more or less competent or skillful in a certain area, that didn't really affect their sense of self-respect. So I thought that was very interesting. So for me, veganism, of course, is a key part of that. How would you say veganism relates to self-love for you personally?
Yeah. Well, again, you've said it beautifully. That line, I'm glad you brought up integrity. It is that alignment with what you know, your values, the basis, the philosophical basis on which you live your life, whether that's loyalty to family or health or, you know, integrity or whatever it might be. But for the vegan and for myself, of course, there was this enormous peace that came when I felt, and I live in the question that there's more, I'm sure, is my espoused values were in alignment with my actions. And I was grateful for the opportunity for something to come into my life that said, oh my gosh, if I want to do everything I can not to hurt animals, my vegetarianism is hopefully inadequate. And how come I didn't know that? So you living in that question is, what else don't I know? But absolutely. And I think this is a big challenge we're offering people at the moment when we invite people to the journey of your life with veganism, is once you've made someone aware, without even saying it really, that their espoused values are being decent people that don't want to hurt animals, and you're saying, but you're complicit in doing it. It doesn't matter who takes the action, you're paying for it. And perhaps we don't say it doesn't in any confidence, that's implied. And I think that's why we get such a strong reaction, is people realize either at a conscious or unconscious level that they are living out of alignment with their values. And therefore, there's this huge resistance, because you can't say, you know, I think it's wrong to go around bashing other people up or animals or anything, when they've just come into the awareness that that is happening. They knew it. You know, what did they think was happening? These things don't just appear in shrink wrap. But we've actually made them uncomfortable. And they often shoot the messenger. They're not bad people per se, I would say. They're good people possibly doing bad things. And it isn't their fault that they didn't know, but when they know, it is their responsibility. And I would say that self-love would come where that is that alignment, that self-respect, that you are doing everything you can to walk your talk. And I think that's really important. But for me, you know, it was just, well, firstly, the reaction of finding out about what was happening to animals. And this sounds so funny now, is the thought when my partner, Brendan, said, we've got to watch this. This is just, and we watched it and we all became vegan, including the dogs at the time. That's 16 plus years ago.
What was it you watched?
We watched Meet Your Meat. There would be that one. It would be Earthlings. It was all those sort of things. It was, oh my gosh. But we had that moment when we thought, are we going to die? Can we live like this? You know, I've been vegetarian for over 30 years. But what was interesting is I actually, and this does it to inspire people, is the fact how far we've come in terms of awareness and this collective unconscious shift, is we looked at each other. I said, what if it's only you, me, and the woman in the guy taking the video and the woman in the video in the piggery? What if we're the only people who know about this? we became vegan before we knew we were vegan, which is really funny. Which it's just it's an important value-based word, but you know, vegan. Well, that's right. Vegan just encompasses so much, that philosophical value-based integrity. You know, and it's when it happens at that level, we just happen to give it a word. We all knew what vystopia was before Clare came up with the word. It was an experience. And I think that's the best way to actually, rather than a marketing way where people put all sorts of concepts out there, you know, to do with, you know, self-love or self-deprecation. And that's what we need now. Okay. Right. But I also, in saying the thing about veganism, is love, I would say, is not a feeling. You know, it's perhaps experienced through our senses, our intuition, our physical and intuitive and spiritual senses, but it's not a feeling. It's not conditional. It's something we're trying to grasp.
Right. It's a practice. Yeah, I think that's
a state of being. That's right.
Yeah. So you're in a committed, loving relationship with another person. How do you maintain your sense of self and your self-love within that framework?
Well, that's very interesting, because my partner is also my best friend, I would say. That's very interesting. I think it's how it all started, to be honest with you, because, and I will tell you a very quick story, over 25 years ago. And I was living in London and a very successful career. I was teaching in a university, and I was doing consultancy as well. And I had this lovely apartment, and life was good. And I had friends, and boyfriends and all sorts of things. And I was doing a lot of travel with my job. It was great. And then I was starting to come to my late 30s, and I thought, gosh, I had been married earlier in my early 20s, but I'm deeply friends with I'm vegan, which is fantastic after a reconnection. I thought to myself, gosh, I'm nearly 40.
Oops,
Maybe I
you
won't.
froze on me for a second. So I
Oh,
missed part of what you were saying. So we got to the part where life was good and
yep.
you were in your late 30s and then something happened.
Yeah. And then I said to myself, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to meet anyone. Maybe I won't get married. Maybe I won't have children. Okay. So there was that sort of, and I thought, I'd done a lot of personal development. I was in my own therapy at the time that went on for several years, trying to be the best I could be and work through some normal life things. And I said to myself, well, maybe that's not going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, I've got to be really happy with this, because I didn't want to be that experience of, oh gosh, there's these regrets, or I'm constantly looking for that opportunity, or becoming, that's the thing that will make me happy, and I realized, I think all people can make a mistake, is when I have X, Y, Z, I will be happy. And that's very conditional of oneself. And I thought, okay, well, I'm actually going to just accept this situation then. And I'm just going to live my life exactly now. And if something comes along, great. And I'm not going to date anyone for a year. I'm not going to do any of that. And that's what I did. And I was perfectly happy and wandering along. And then my partner, Brendan, came into my life. And it was great because I was no longer looking. And I remember he had been, someone had tried to introduce us for previous 7 years, but I had been out the country. He was in England, then he went back to Australia, and we went, and this happened over 7 years. We never quite got back together. And so what actually happened is my father was actually up on holiday and smiled, he's no longer here. And what we actually, he said, well, hey, look, I like bushwalking. I come from New Zealand. There's a public holiday. Do you want to go walk? I said, yeah, it's great. And I was a bit older than him. And so I just thought, this is great. I'll just go bushwalking. It was nice. We spent a whole day together. We just met each other as two individuals that had done a lot of work on ourselves, and we were just there. And then at the end of the evening, when we had a meal and things, he said, I've got to ask you this. Do you think there's ever a chance we could get together? But this is the point of self-love, which actually set the whole scene, I think, for both of us. I went, yes. Not yes, oh yes, I'd like to see you. I'm no longer looking. And I was totally myself. I wasn't putting on this, oh gosh, where's this going? And I was free, and I could have walked away at that moment. And that was the beauty of this. So I think having come together with Brendan like that, he actually went back to Australia. We were a few months in between. We met up again, decided, yes, we did want to be together after quite a while. And then we decided to move to Australia. But that has set the scene. And I think it's because we've both done a lot of work on ourselves. We both have a real sense of individuality. And there's that interdependence and supporting each other and really wanting the best for each other, but not making that person that your happiness is conditional on them. I find it an absolute, honor is not the right word. When we're with someone, we spend that much time with someone, that in itself is because the opportunity cost for each of us is great. If we're not together, we're denying all these other things we might be doing in a very limited existential thing called time. And so that's pretty special. You've got this unique existential being, and he's a man of integrity, and so our values are aligned. Over my life, I've seen the happiest couples is when there are some real core values, the most core values of each person are actually in alignment. And when they're not, I think there's this trying to get other people to do things, trying to be something. So I guess that's the answer. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. And it's calling to mind, back in the day, I read a lot of Eric Fromm's work, and he wrote a
Yes.
lot about self-love, all
Yeah.
kinds of love, but he wrote a great deal about self-love. And he really made a very convincing case. It's been a long time since I've read those books, but I made a very convincing case for our own nature, where we are as a person, having more bearing on the success of our relationships than,
Yes.
the particular combination, so it's much less a question of meeting just the right person and having just the right, combination of characteristics. than,
Yeah.
just being solid and secure and having that loving orientation toward ourselves, so
Yes.
that, like you said, we don't need
Mhm.
to put that other person on a pedestal. We don't need to look for them to satisfy every want and desire.
Yeah.
We're
Mm.
okay in ourselves. We're complete within ourselves,
Yeah.
and then we can enjoy the other person's coming. We're free. We're free.
There you go. You're back at the free. I think that's it. You're free to actually be yourself. But you know that person's got your back in the sense they want the best for you because they're choosing to be with you. But they're not afraid to point out things. Do you know what I like about the relationship I'm in is, we're very supportive of each other's dreams, and we do a lot of work together and run a lot of training programs. But he is very much, he's not afraid to point out things. He's actually, outside of you come back from a situation is, you were having that discussion with someone. Actually, I actually think they were right. He's not afraid. Whereas I've seen
Mm,
so many couples over the years, well, why didn't you agree with me? And the person
mm,
says, yeah, okay, I'll support you. They assume themselves. And
mm.
there's where the intimacy's gone. Whereas someone is not going to choose to embarrass you or have attack you in a group situation, possibly because they just want the best for you and they're generous, but they're not afraid. They would be out of integrity if they didn't point out, it's actually, no, I don't agree with you. This isn't the way forward.
Right.
And
Right.
which is, I think, is healthy. Now, Dr. Will Tuttle, in his new book, of course, talks about quality of relationships and some of the ingredients for that. So I'm looking forward to actually re-accessing that book. But Martin Buber, he was a existential rabbi. Um, he wrote a book. He talked about the concept of I thou, that's what it was called. And I think this is a very valuable one. He said, when we meet people, we can operate in an I thou or an I it component. So, say I'm sitting with you, if I relate to you as an I it, I see you as a woman of a certain age, I assume certain things about education, professionalism, values, things we might have in common, all those sort of things. I have created you. Okay, so I've fixed you. And so I'm operating, I've reduced you down. Okay, if we operate as an I thou, I can obviously we have a social shorthand to try and make sense of how we respond in a certain way quickly. But an I thou means I sit with you with the infinite possibilities of who you may be. And I'm sure you have had experiences and things that have happened in your life that you aren't even bringing to consciousness at the moment, but that brings you to the table. And we sit with the infinite possibilities. The co-creation comes where that's where creativity comes, or helping people to shift and heal. But we can only do that when we have that I thou relationship, I think, with ourselves, rather than objectifying. And that's certainly the same in an intimate one-to-one relationship.
Right. And just that ability to be present in that ever-changing moment, and which
Mm,
is dynamic, it's never fixed, so not to become too attached to any impression we have of somebody, or
yes,
too attached to how that person is reflecting me, or who I like to think I am,
that's
or
right.
how I am. The
Yes.
the analogy that always comes to mind for me is that I feel like for a long time, and possibly even still, what kind of
Mm.
gets in my way of other people, it's sort of the equivalent of trying to look through a window, and all I can see is my own reflection in that window. I'm so
Ah,
blind, just
yes,
my vision is impaired by all my own baggage and all my own,
yes, yeah.
unhealthy self stuff. And so
Mm,
the more I can let that fall away and just be present and see the other person. I think it was,
yes.
somebody else, I'm sure Eric Fromm said
Mm,
something to this effect too, but essentially the act of seeing is love, that, and
yes,
like you alluded
yeah,
to, honesty. Part of seeing is honesty. If
yeah,
we're operating under false impressions or
yeah,
misrepresenting our impressions, then
yeah.
that's not truly
Mm.
seeing.
And
All
of
right.
course,
Yeah.
and I know we're very short of time, but just as you're saying this, I'm thinking about the online dating thing where people are looking for love, but actually it is a projection of one's wants and desires, and purely
Right.
usually based on physical attraction. And I've come across people who have said, I talked to this person for 3 months online, Then we sort of had a phone call. And then when I had them, I had to progress the relationship into an intimate one because we knew each other so well. They had never been in the physical presence of each other. And
Right.
so I think this is feeding narcissism, because it's all it is a projection of your stereotypes onto that, this fixed
Yes.
notion of a self, which that is how we treat others, is really how we're treating ourselves in many ways. So if we're harsh on people and we judge them, we can't give to others probably what we can't give to ourselves. So
Right, right. And just this fantasy that we build up without even realizing that we're doing it. Yeah, there's no
yeah,
substitute for that physical presence with other people.
that's
I
right.
learned that long ago during
Yeah.
my
Well, I
experience.
think this is where animals can teach us so much about self-love and being present and being
Yeah.
there, and as we know.
Yes, 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 definitely. Well, one question that I'd love to get your thoughts on is how do you keep loving yourself when you're failing or when you're not performing to your own standards? What does self-love look like in those situations?
Um, well, I say I've done a lot of work over decades to work with my mindset and my self-talk, and um, I don't have moments these days when I go, oh, I can't believe it's literally, oh gosh, I
Right.
wish I hadn't done that, or I'm quite high standard. I wanted to double check that. Why did that go out in that sort of way? But it's this momentary. It's like, oh gosh, it's I can correct that. Nothing is that important. Of course, when you become a vegan and you know what's going on in the world, everything sort of pales into its insignificance in one sense of the challenges that animals
Right,
have. That's
right,
been a
right.
great marker for me, but I see myself as a work in progress. And that doesn't mean I'm not afraid to go, hey, you need to pull yourself up here, how you dealt with that person, or, perhaps a level of, internal criticism of others sometimes, possibly. That's not an act of how we are with others, is how we are with our, but also I don't want to be that person who's just so ungenerous. So I'll pull myself up in those moments and go,
Mm.
hey, what's going on here. But failing is an interesting thing, isn't it? Is what failings are increments towards something much bigger.
Right,
It's like when
right.
someone starts a venture and it fails, it really is it the universe or something saying you're not thinking big enough?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And
Mm,
even just that word, it calls to mind. I'm
mm.
sure you're familiar with the book Mindset by
Yes.
Carol
Yeah.
Dweck, because that
Absolutely.
book was something that really was
Yeah.
illuminating for me. And the opening chapter of that book was this experiment that they did with children, giving them
Mm.
increasingly difficult puzzles, puzzles of increasing
Yes.
levels of
Mm.
difficulty. And the aim of the experiment was to see how different types of kids handled failing. But
Yeah.
what they determined was that some kids, the harder the puzzles got and the more challenging the task
Yeah.
became, the more they enjoyed it and the more they reveled in it.
Yes.
And the more they
Yeah.
just really said, oh, I love a challenge and this is so fun and I can't wait to figure this out. And what
Yeah.
they determined was these kids didn't think they were failing.
No.
They weren't finished yet. So
Yeah.
just eliminating that whole concept of failing. What does that even mean? I think
Well,
that's a great
I
point.
think
Yeah.
you've said that is, because it's actually a marker against some predetermined way.
Right,
Is,
right,
it's like,
right.
is it um who invented the light bulb? Did he come up with? People kept saying to him, Edison, and they kept
Yeah.
saying to him, "Oh, for goodness' sake, it's just failing. It's not going to work." And he said, "No, I've found 7,999 ways for it how not to do it."
Right,
Because
right,
failure
right.
is, again, it's that objectivity, isn't it? As opposed to the journey, it's focusing on the destination. I was
Yes.
going to do X, Y, Z. I didn't. I feel like a failure. I think that's an existential relinquishing of responsibility that says, oh, well, I was too old, not rich enough, didn't get the right
Right,
sponsors, didn't put
right.
the effort in, as opposed to taking absolute responsibility as, what was my part in that? Was the level at which I was playing, was that, but also have I found another way to do it? And I think when we
Yes.
decide the outcome of something, outcome of our happiness, outcome of our well-being, outcome of what we think people need is, but if we work with people to co-create, lots of wonderful things can come of that. Mm.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place
Mm.
to wrap things up. But it really just, for me, it brings home to me just in my own self-love journey, just how existential a shift
Yeah,
has occurred.
yeah,
Because, originally I may have thought of self-love as just practicing some affirmations here and there. But it really has for me shifted over time to the point of where, when I asked you that question, I could see in your whole expression that you really couldn't even relate to feeling
mm,
any,
yeah,
hatred or deep anger at yourself for,
yeah,
not succeeding yet at a task or
mm,
something, that you just didn't operate in that paradigm
yeah.
anymore. So I think
No, yes,
it's just very interesting. Yeah, I can see it in you, and
yeah,
just and it's
yes,
helped me recognize for me that,
mm,
yeah, the self-love journey really has been, it's been incremental, but ultimately
yeah,
it really has shifted the framework in which I operate and which I
yeah.
live. So
But that was the co-creation because you
mm.
saw that in me, and it
Yes.
brought something up in you for you to bring another lesson to the people listening. And this is the
Right.
beauty of it. But I
Yeah.
see so many vegans who are suffering from dystopia, is they don't afford themselves that self-love. I'm not worthy. When the animals are suffering like that, when the world is so bad, how could I possibly be that indulgent? I think this is an aspect of dystopia. And
Mm.
really, I say to people, we want a loving, kind, compassionate, healthy, abundant world. We have to start by
With
donating on
ourselves.
healthy, loving, compassionate, and I guess this is, that need for that vystopia, what I call vystopia recovery, which I'm really trying to help
Yes.
people with at the moment, to move through that, because we're the instrument of change. And if you dislike yourself, and I don't like this word, I don't even like using it. I hate people say they hate themselves. What are you saying to the world? Well, I don't like her. You can have her. you know. Hmm.
Right. Right. Well,
Hmm.
thank you so much, Claire, for sharing your thoughts on self-love and for all your great work, helping animals and helping human animals with dystopia.
Thank you.
Where's the best place for people to find you if they're still struggling with
So it's
dystopia?
Yeah, well, it is veganpsychologist.com, of course, but I periodically run free 3-day masterclasses called Vystopia Recovery. And people can get that on veganpsychologist.com, master class register.
Wonderful. Well, we'll include all that information in the show notes. And thank you so much. It's been wonderful chatting with
Thank you
you.
too.